All right, welcome to Module 8. This week we're going to talk about individualized education programs, also known as IEPs. Our mini lecture goals are to do a brief review of Module 7. We'll talk about IEPs more broadly in terms of understanding what they are, and then more specifics after a little break about how to write them. And then we'll wrap up with some things coming up in the next couple weeks. So last week you read about social skills instruction, and so just take a few minutes to think about the goals of social skills instructions. Why are they helpful? What's important about them? How are they useful, right? One of the things that we talked about last week was that there's some evidence that shows that social skills instruction is very useful. And then on the other hand, there are some researchers who are saying, oh, we're not quite sure. And so be able to describe some of those reasons about why we're not quite sure. For example, are social skills instructions socially valid, right? Are they meeting the needs of students in terms of the function? So are you teaching them replacement and behaviors that meet the function of the challenging behavior that existed beforehand? Um, we know that in some cases, social skills instructions haven't been implemented with fidelity or with the correct amount of intensity, also known as the dosage. And so that's caused some issues with being able to say, are these really useful? So just think about back to those things. A couple of you had questions about how to use social skills instructions in practice, and a lot of the social skills instructions that we talk about are embedded in other supports, such as token economies. And for students who struggle with emotional behavioral disorders, you are often able to collaborate with a behavioral therapist or a social worker who is the caseworker. And so you have a team. So I don't want you to feel like you're alone in implementing any of the interventions we discussed in this class, but you always have a team that you can collaborate with. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about how to support students in this regard. You also want to be able to know more about why it's important to differentiate between performance deficits and skills deficits, right? So if it's a skill deficit, that means you need to teach the child how to perform that. But before they can perform, right? So having the knowledge of the skill is a prerequisite to performance. If it's a performance deficit, that just means they aren't engaging in the behavior that has already been learned. So being able to identify that helps to kind of target where you should focus your energy in terms of the behavior modification or behavior intervention. And finally, what are some cultural considerations as they're related to social skills interventions or instructions? I'm sorry. Being about the impact of our cultural diversity and how that contributes to what we know about social considerations within the context of the classroom. Okay, and then now we're going to move forward to procedural requirements as it's related to the individualized education program. So the provisions under IDEA require that schools follow the law when developing IEPs. And these are essentially safeguards that prevent rulings that deem the IEP implementation inappropriate. And so it's important for us as teachers, for you as teachers or related service providers, to be familiar with the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, because it includes those special ed laws that help you to avoid going to court, essentially. So it really is mandated law that guides what we're supposed to do in terms of providing special education services. And when you follow it, it helps you from avoiding any tough situations um, and finding yourselves in court cases, etc. So your chapter this week in chapter 8 talks about the substantive requirements and then the procedural requirements. So the substantive requirements, those are essentially referring to the content of the special ed program. So what content are you going to deliver? What behavior targets, goals are you going to focus on? What academic goals are you focusing on? And this requirement compels the schools to provide an education that is not only meaningful but also beneficial to your students. So you have to be able to demonstrate that this IEP embeds goals that has meaning and includes measurable goals that can demonstrate the benefit over time. So that's where we will start to talk more about measurable objective and measurable goals that can demonstrate student learning over time. And then one of the critical components of this is to ask yourself, is my student making educational progress? Are my students making educational progress? And that's really a big piece of this substantial requirement, because your goal is to essentially demonstrate that your students are making progress over time, as required by the IDEA. So then what exactly is an IEP? It is an educational blueprint of the student's FAPE. So hopefully everyone remembers that FAPE is free and appropriate public education, which is one of those 6 components of the IDEA. So remember when we talked about those 6 components, FAPE was one of those. If you're trying to remember, like, what were some of those others, please go back and make sure you can refresh your memory. I think that might have been module 2, maybe even 1. Um, so make sure you remember those other 5 components of IDEA. But the FAPE is really what's guiding your students' IEPs. So it's been individually tailored to meet each student's need, and it is really the cornerstone of special education. So the IEP really guides so much of what we do within the field of special education. It's kind of your handbook, if you will. So here's a nice little video. She talks for about 3 minutes about what the IEP is and how it can be useful. So take a quick few minutes to watch this video, and then jot down any things that come to mind or any reflections you want to have later in the lecture, or feel free to share those this week on your reflection. So what is the actual purpose of the IEP? One is to, as we sort of already mentioned, to establish this foundation or blueprint for the special ed services that you'll provide for your students. But more specifically, the goal is to involve both school personnel and parents in helping to determine what special education and related services are needed or required and appropriate for your students. So remember, free and appropriate public education. So it serves as a written contract that requires the school district or the LEA to provide a FAPE, a free and appropriate public education. And the IEP also commits the school to providing specific special education and related services in a good faith effort. Now, that good faith effort part is important because there are some cases in which we engage in the least restrictive environment. We are providing a free and appropriate public education to the best extent possible. But there are some schools where that capacity is met in terms of personnel, or the training and background has been the level of required training and background has been exceeded by the needs of that student. And so there are some situations where a different placement is required because the staff, the educators, the teachers, the behavioral specialists, whoever's there, the related service providers, have put in a good faith effort towards providing specific special education, but they aren't meeting the needs of those students. And in those cases, you may see a change in placement. And so you have to demonstrate, though, that you have put in that effort. That's a key piece. You can't say, like, we don't know how to do behavioral intervention plans. That's not going to cut it, right? So you have to demonstrate that you've collected data, that you've implemented the behavioral plan, that you have followed the guidelines of the IEP. And then if you're still struggling with demonstrating that, you may have further considerations. But that good faith effort is a critical piece. So, additional purposes are to allow the government agencies and courts to monitor education services and schools compliance. So, we need some way at a federal level, at a state level, at a local LEA level to identify what services are being provided and also how we're complying with those laws. And so, the IEP reports help us to keep measure of that, keep a record of that. And then it also serves as an evaluation with the inclusion of measurable goals and objectives. So if your goals and objectives are measurable, then we can use those to evaluate student outcomes. And in some cases, they reflect, as I'm sure some of you are aware, teacher outcomes and performance evaluations as well. So the mandate piece, it essentially requires that students, that we're meeting the needs of the students. So the IEP has to meet the students' needs. The IEP has to be developed before the special ed services can be provided. So, if the student goes through the assessment, you've identified that he or she has one of the 13 fits within one of the 13 disability categories, and the needs related to that disability category are inhibiting his or her educational process or progress, excuse me. Then you can't just decide, okay, tomorrow you're going to start getting speech language therapy and social, 30 minutes a day with the social worker. So that's not how it works. You have to develop the IEP. Everyone has to be on board. It has to be signed and approved before your services can begin. And when you think about the IEP, you have to acknowledge that it's not only a piece of paper or, a document, but that it's also a process. And so within this, you are providing a service. So it's kind of a document that outlines what you will be providing for your students. So, in terms of developing the IEP, after the first 30 days, within those first 30 days, excuse me, the IEP team must meet to develop the actual IEP. So, once it's been determined that a student is eligible for special ed services, you have 30 days to convene the team. And this is often when teachers and IEP teams, other service providers, struggle with connecting with parents because if there are some cases where parents are, this is very new to them or this is overwhelming, and sometimes we get in trouble with that, 30-day window. But it's really critical to make that connection and to be able to convene as a team to initiate those services as soon as possible. It is permissible, however, to bring a draft of the IEP to the meeting, but you have to have discussion. So again, going back to parents, you can't just show up and say, "Hi, Mrs. Jones, here's the IEP we've drafted. We just want you to sign it, and then we'll start services by." Not to say that doesn't happen, because unfortunately there are some cases where, similar situations occur and parents aren't able to have much of an input, or maybe they want to, but they're overwhelmed, or maybe they don't understand the language. And so we want to be sure that even if you're drafting your goals and objectives beforehand, which clearly you should be, that you're not presenting them as a end all be all. That you're bringing those as a draft, and that you're ready to have a discussion about that. And then finally, the parent consent is required to provide services that are outlined in the IEP. Some other issues related to the development, the IEP must be implemented as soon as possible after the meeting. So, you have the 30-day window, and then you have your meeting, and then as soon as everyone has signed off on the actual IEP, the services should be implemented ASAP. Now, there are a few exceptions to that, such as when students need special arrangement of transportation, for example. So, there may be students who need taxi services to go to a particular school that is most appropriate for their needs. And if it takes there are some cases where it might take a while to get that in order, or if they need to ride a special bus, sometimes those sorts of accommodations can take a little longer. But in most cases, you should be able to start implementing services pretty quickly thereafter. You should also note that an IEP team member can be excused for part or all of the meetings if the parents and the IEP team agree that that person doesn't need to be there for the whole time. So you see this fairly often with specialists, such as like adaptive PE teachers or other adaptive specialists who, can step in, share what their goals are, what their experiences have been with that student over the past year, or whatever length of time they've been working with them, and then they can step out when they're not needed, and so that's perfectly fine. It's We tend to have cycles of IEP meetings, or seasons rather, where everyone is swamped with IEP meetings. And so staff understand that, many people will have several other meetings. So it's important, obviously, to attend to the needs of each of your students. But if you're able to do that and also step out of the meeting That's perfectly fine. For many of you who will be special educators, you will obviously have a caseload of students and you will need to attend the meeting and in many cases actually facilitate that meeting. So you will not be the one stepping out. But just so you know, if you're working with other specialists, that it might be appropriate in some cases for them to step out. And then finally, you can have an IEP meeting in an alternative format if the parents in school agree. So if you have a parent who is immobile but wants to make sure that he or she is able to take part in the IEP meeting, you can set it up via Skype, sometimes via phone. Um, there have been cases where teams go to families' houses when it's agreed upon, because the goal is that it's in a convenient and agreed upon location. And if it's if a parent's lack of transportation or something or mobility inhibits their ability to come into the school setting, then you want to meet them where they are. And so that might be in their home, or maybe they don't feel comfortable in the school setting, so it's in a local library. You have to work out all of those kinks, but it is feasible and acceptable to have an IEP meeting in an alternative setting. In terms of developing the IEP, is that an existing first thing to note is that an existing IEP can be amended without a meeting if the team members all agree. And so the parent has to sign a waiver of an IEP meeting to amend it, to say, okay, it's okay if you make these changes, I understand, and it can be amended rather than redrafted when applicable. So, for example, I talked to a mom a few weeks ago who had an IEP annual review for her son, and some of the goals that were included, she didn't feel comfortable addressing her concerns related to those goals in the meeting. Like, she was very overwhelmed, and she had some time to think about those after the fact. And she said, "You know what, Jamie? I think it'd be good if we go back in, she and her the related service providers, and make some amendments to this." And I said, "I think that's a great idea. Now that you've had time to think about what those changes might be, you can suggest those and you can go back in for a redraft or for simple amendments," which I think her son's teachers would definitely agree with. And so it's important to let parents know that that's an option, and also for you to know that it is an option to amend an IEP when appropriate. Another thing to note is that transfer students must also receive free and appropriate public education in accordance with their previous IEP. So if you have a student who comes in the middle of the year, whatever their previous IEP was, you are essentially required to, not essentially, you are required to implement the IEP as it was designed in their previous placement. Now, if you find that some of these goals are just completely off base, or if you feel like the objectives are not meeting the student's needs, then you can propose an amendment. But in the initial when the student first gets there, you should be implementing it exactly as written. I'm going to pause right here to make sure our recording is working okay, and then I'll jump back on and we'll start with the required components of the IEP. Okay, so we are going to continue with the required components of the IEP, and I will start with just kind of walking through each of these pieces. So you will have read, or will read this week if you haven't already read for this week, about each of the legal requirements that should be embedded in your individualized education program. And the first one is the present level of performance. You'll also see that referred to as the PLAAFP. So it's the present level of academic achievement and functional performance. And so this is where you talk about how your student is performing at the present, in the present, and it's really kind of that first component of the IEP that describes students' performance, and it's important that we include both academic and functional performance. And so this is where you want to describe how your student's disability is impacting his or her involvement in the general education setting, or how he or she is able to engage with the general education curriculum. So the main purpose there is to describe what problems the students might face in terms of having annual goals, and then it helps to determine what special ed services can be inter, uh, embedded in his or her program. Sorry, and then also it helps us to outline ways to measure performance. The second piece is the annual goals and short term objectives. So, having measurable annual goals is super critical, and the measurable part is very important. We'll talk more about how to establish measurable goals as we go throughout this module. But essentially, after the team develops the PLAAFP statement, you'll also develop the students' annual goals or measurable annual goals. And this includes measurable goals for both functional and academic skills. And so the annual goals really focus on how you will be able to remediate the students' difficulties or areas of challenge based on the statement. For example, if you say in terms of the present level of performance, Jonathan engages in outbursts when he is asked to complete, I don't know, when he's asked to um, work on social skills worksheet or something like that, for an example. So you're targeting the anger outburst during an independent work activity. And so your annual goal should be something that addresses having fewer anger outbursts during an independent work activity. And part of that will be, how do you identify the function of that behavior? So you'll notice that the way your IEP is written will be such that you are including behavioral intervention plans and you're engaging in functional behavioral assessments, which I'm sure you saw in your chapter for this module. And so you want to state to what extent the students' areas of need will be addressed via your short term and annual goals. You also want a statement that describes the extent of participation in the general education setting. So, a lot of times we'll see this in terms of the percentage of the day that the student will spend in the general education setting. So, you may see some goals that say student will spend 30% of the day in the general education setting. The next piece is the behavior intervention plan. Um, so you want to describe what behavioral supports will be included. You also want to talk about the dates, the frequency, and the duration of services. So how many minutes of speech language therapy, how often per week, for example. And then you will need to describe how you will evaluate the strategies for evaluation, or how you will evaluate the outcomes. And then for students who are 16 and older, you will want to talk about a transition plan for how they will transition into young adulthood post high school or secondary education. So those are the components, and we'll kind of hit especially on the PLAAFP and then the annual goals, or I'm sorry, the measurable goals as we go throughout. So let's talk a little bit about the IEP team. We've been talking about the some of the components and how it works and why we have it, but we want to also talk about who is included on the team. So the required participants on the IEP team include the parents or guardians. You should also have the special education teacher, the general education teacher, a school district representative that can commit district resources. So sometimes this might be the director, the EC director from the school district, or an assistant director. It might be another representative from the district, but sometimes when you have IEP meetings that are particularly contentious or have a record of having difficult conversations, or where there's been threats of bringing lawyers or anything like that, you're more likely to see the director of the exceptional children's department for that district sit in on those IEP team meetings. And then also someone who can interpret the evaluation results. So this is usually your school psychologist. The team typically also includes related service providers such as speech language pathologists or occupational therapists. It might include physical therapists or behavioral interventionists. For students who are 16 or older, it is required that they sit in on their IEP team meetings, and they don't necessarily need to be there the entire time. I'm sure you can imagine that for some students who struggle with behavioral issues, it could be, um, a long time for them to sit there. And, so essentially they need to be a part of the process, but they don't necessarily have to sit in the entire meeting if it's not appropriate for them. Maybe they need to take a break and come back. Um, and then transition services personnel. So each LEA has a transition representative who can help sort of facilitate the process for transitioning into young adulthood and what that might look like for each student. For example, some students may be transitioning into vocational programs, others may be transitioning into community colleges and or university settings. And so that person is responsible for helping the team navigate that process for transition. It's super critical that parents be involved and that they feel like their participation is important in IEP meetings. So once a notification is sent, 10 days is usually considered an adequate amount of time for parents to be notified. You might encounter families who need a little more time. So this is where it's important to think about that responsivity to the needs of families, be it, you know, cultural needs, or whether it's related to finances, whether it's related to their job situations. So you might have a parent who has just received his or her work schedule for the next 2 weeks. And if that 10-day mark falls within, that 10-day mark falls within that 2 week schedule that's already been put out, then you have to be understanding that they may not be able to make it on the date that you suggest. So it's important to try to have make that be more of a conversation and find a time that works well for the parent, and not just say, "Okay, we're meeting on this date and you need to be there," because that often the isn't going to work, and it's clearly not a best practice for ways to engage with parents in effective partnerships. I mentioned this earlier in this presentation that the meetings should be held at a mutually agreeable time and location. So this might be a non-traditional location outside of the school setting. Excuse me. And then when parents are not able to attend, there are some alternative methods, such as a representative who can sit in on behalf of the child, or other means of engaging in the IEP process. The parents can also sign off on their right to be present at the meeting. So those are some of those special considerations, but we do our very best to make sure that the parents are able to be present. A non custodial parent can attend the IEP meeting if the rights are not terminated. So, as long as he or she still has rights, parental rights, then they can attend. And then, foster parents are recognized as the student's parents for legal purposes. So, in the case of foster parenting, that person is entitled to sign off and to be present and to sit in the role of the parent for students in that regard. Similarly, surrogate parents can be identified if the biological parents are not cannot be located. And so this is a process where students who are either in foster care, or who are in positions where their parents can't be located, there may be a surrogate parent or an advocate who can sit in on their behalf. So here's a quick video. She works with the Department of, or the equivalent of exceptional children in Chicago public schools, and she talks a little bit about the importance of parent participation and when parents should become involved with their child's IEP. So take a look at that, and then we'll move forward. So, here, just take a minute after watching the video, kind of reflect on your thoughts around the video, but then also take a minute to think about what your experiences have been as they relate to IEPs to date. And how have those experiences shaped your current views, feelings, and perceptions about the IEP process? So, have you sat in on IEPs? Have you been in ones where they're more argumentative? Have you no idea what even occurs during an IEP? What are some of your perceptions of the IEP process, and then what do you foresee as challenges to developing and implementing an IEP? And I just want to note that whatever you foresee as a challenge is something that we will overcome throughout the course. So keep that in mind. And then after you finish your reflection, feel free to take a break. We kind of I've been trying to embed these breaks because I think it is important to pause for a little bit and regroup before you start back. But of course, do what you need to do because it's an online class. So that's the nice part about it. And then when you're ready, we'll talk more through the content of the IEP. So I've been referencing this PLAAFP, which seems to be a mouthful, which again is the present level of academic achievement and functional performance. And this is essentially a statement that describes how the disability impacts the student's participation in the general education setting. And it should include the academic performance, the test scores, any emotional and social development pieces, any pre-vocational or vocational skills that are present. So here you have a checklist for the PLAAFP statements, and this is also in your book. It's in your chapter 8, so you can find this checklist. So for example, you want to make sure that the statement is precise enough to lead to measurable annual goals. Okay, and you want to be able to determine if the statement is describes only the unique needs that will be addressed in the IEP. And similarly, you want to be able to do to identify if all the needs within the PLAAFP lead to an annual goal or lead to special education services or lead to a combination. So essentially, the goal is not to describe, you know, current behaviors or performance that doesn't lead to the development of a measurable goal, because the entire purpose is to develop measurable goals that will facilitate learning and development for your students. So here's an example that you can read through, and I want you to kind of look back at this checklist and identify whether or not it meets each of these checklist items. So, another piece of the content is the measurable annual goals, and those are based on the current level of performance. So, that's why you need to develop the PLAAFP before you can move into the measurable annual goals. And so, typically, we identify one or more goals per need. And the purpose of the goals and objectives is to determine whether a student is making educational progress, and also if the student is in a special education program that is appropriate for his or her needs. And as I mentioned in the earlier part of the lecture, sometimes they're not in the appropriate setting, and we have to acknowledge when that is the case. Um, and we know that the measurable annual goals are crucial for the success of the IEP. If the goals aren't measurable, we aren't able to determine how students are performing, and that's a really critical piece. You should also note that short term objectives are no longer required for most students, and the measurable annual goals includes how and when measurement will occur, and requires reporting at least as often as the reports for general education students. So we don't get to decide, oh, these students are in special education, so we're going to report every 4 years. You are required to report at least as often as you do for general education students. So again, here's a checklist for the measurable goals, and the first item is, are they linked to the assessment and the PLAAFP statements? So you want your PLAAFP to be directly correlated with your measurable goals. You want to be sure that they're clear, specific, and measurable. That's why they're called measurable goals. You want to Identify whether or not the goals section of the IEP contains information about how the student's progress will be measured. So, how will you engage in progress monitoring? How will you measure their progress over time? Can the goals be used to evaluate the effectiveness of the IEP? So, given the goals, given your measurement protocol, can you use those tools to identify, yes, this IEP is addressing this student's needs, or no, this is not a good way to determine whether or not we're addressing this student's needs. So look through your checklist, and I think there are some examples of some measurable goals in your book, so you might want to just kind of sit down with this checklist and then look at those goals, and then we'll have a couple more examples in the next slides. So have a quick pause and practice activity here. Just look through these and think through each of these words. Do you think using a word such as draw is measurable or not measurable? What about understand or feel? So read through each of these words and then just kind of note, whether you think it's measurable or not measurable, and then we'll talk about those on the next slide. So draw, is that something that you can measure? Absolutely. You can observe that. You can see it. Turn in is a behavior that can be observed and seen and recorded. Determine, appreciate, enhance, understand. Those are much more abstract sorts of I want to call them measures, but they're not actually measures. There are perceptions, those are perceived notions that cannot be concretely measured. And also things like feel and develop, participate. You really want to operationally define what it is. So when you use words like understand, the goal is for a student to understand classroom expectations by lining up in lining up with peers during transitions. So what is it that you're really getting at by understanding? You actually want them to line up, right? So that's something you can measure. You can observe whether or not they line up with the peers during transitions appropriately, whether or not they turn in homework, whether or not they are able to label particular objects. So be careful with how the terminology that you use in terms of it being measurable or not. So these are a few hints for writing more measurable goals. You want to stick with words like write, draw, list, perform, state, point to, things that are concrete and can be measured and observed. And then you want to avoid things like value or tolerate or enjoy, because those are feelings that we aren't able to objectively identify and measure. So you want to be sure that the observable and measurable skills are demonstrated, and they're something that can be seen and or heard by an observer, and that the behaviors have a beginning and an end. So here's another opportunity for you to make the call. Read through each of these and then label each one as measurable or not measurable. This will give you a chance to really think through measurable goals, and what should be included in each of those. So here's another quick example. Given 100 high frequency spelling words, a student will correctly spell a minimum of 75 out of 100 on 4 out of 5 times tested on weekly quizzes by June 15, 2018. Now, that sounds like a mouthful, it feels like a mouthful, and quite frankly, it is a mouthful, but it's also measurable, right? Because you know exactly what the student will be performing, what the expectations are, when it will occur or when you're expecting it to occur, and how often it's expected to occur. So this is a measurable goal. One that's not measurable, however, is when you have expectations that are a little more blurry. So this says student will improve positive social interactions using age appropriate behavior with 100% accuracy. Well, what does improve mean? What does appropriate behavior mean? And with 100% accuracy, over what time frame? So you can tell that there are definitely some pieces that are missing from this particular goal. So can the goals be used to evaluate the effectiveness of the IEP? And is the student's progress towards achieving the goals actually measured? So again, this is a non-measurable example, but if we were to revise it so that it would be observable and measurable, we might revise it to read as such. The student will reduce the number of outbursts during small group work activities from 8 times per week to 2 times per week for 4 consecutive weeks as measured by ABC data records. So you've determined exactly what this age appropriate behavior is. Um, you've determined the percentage of performance or the criteria for performance 4 times from 8 times per week to 2 times per week. You've determined the length of time for 4 consecutive weeks and the extent to which or the methods by which you will measure that behavior. So this makes it much more observable and measurable. So when you're thinking about how to develop measurable goals, you'll want to ensure that you embed each of these components. So again, going back to the content of the IP, all of this should be based on the student needs and not the availability of services. So just because you don't have autism specialist in your school or someone who is capable of addressing the needs of students with severe emotional behavioral disorders doesn't mean that you get to write an IEP that doesn't call for those services. So you want to make sure that your IEP is based on student needs and not the availability. You also want to make sure that the amount, the frequency, and the duration of services are appropriate given the needs of your student. And you want to ensure that you are including evidence-based strategies that are appropriate for the needs of students. So some of the things we've talked about for behavioral disorders or for students who struggle with behavior are things like the functional based assessment. Um, We've talked about applied behavior analysis. We've talked about things like token economies. We've talked about social skills instruction, although we know that has both some evidence around the efficacy and some that says, maybe it's useful, maybe it's not. But big picture here, you want to be using interventions and strategies and instructional methods that we know are efficacious in addressing the needs of students with disabilities and not just things that we're pulling out of a hat. Now, at the same time, you might feel like you are pulling things out of a hat, but you should think of it as pulling things out of your toolbox. So you have a toolbox of evidence-based strategies that you can select from, and sometimes you do have to go back and forth with figuring out what works. And that is part of your functional behavioral analysis or assessment and figuring out what is most effective and what can I select from this evidence-based toolbox to address the student's needs. And if this doesn't work, what can I try next, right? It is a lot of trial and error in some cases, but you're using an evidence-based toolbox and not just a, willy-nilly, if you will, selection of strategies. So, a couple other things around the content. Participation in general education, classroom, and high stakes testing is another piece. So, again, we want to talk about the amount of time that the student spends in the general education setting and how much time they spend in a least restrictive environment. You want to be sure that the modifications required to participate in general education are there. So, part of this is finding this unique balance between the least restrictive environment but the most appropriate, free and appropriate public education. And for parents, it's sometimes difficult to sit in on IEP meetings and hear the team say, we think Jonathan would learn best in a self contained autism classroom, or we think Michelle would do best in a EBD classroom. In most cases, parents want to know that their children are learning alongside their typically developing peers, and it's important that you're not only responsive to that. It's critical that you're responsive to that, but that you also help them understand that their students' performance may be contingent upon being in a setting that's more appropriate for their needs. And so that might be something that takes a while for parents to be accepting of and ready for. But you have to be willing to prepared to provide the modifications that students need in general education settings, and also be prepared to help parents understand what the implications are of a student being in a general education setting but not really being able to engage in inclusive activities. Because there's sometimes a tricky situation where you see students sitting in a classroom of general education peers, but they're like over in a corner, right? They're working on their own activity separate from the rest of the peers, and they're in the same physical space, but they're not really engaging in inclusive practices. And that's just something to be careful of in terms of, sure, you're saying they're going to spend 60% of their day in the general education setting, and if that's what's in the IEP, then that's what you should be following. But when it's time to assess your outcomes and look at measurable goals, is the student making progress in that setting? And if the answer to that question is no, then you should be reassessing the setting in which they are learning. Okay? So the accommodations that are required for students to participate in their testing need to be conducted. Or I'm sorry, the accommodations required for students to participate in high stakes testing or alternative assessments to be conducted should be provided as well. So you want to make sure that you're providing the students with whatever it is they need to be able to participate in their assessments. Um, in terms of the time frame, the IEP should be initiated as soon as it's written. Again, we talked about this earlier in the lecture. Um, Transfer students should start within 1 week, and it must be in place before the student is placed in special education. Transition services begin at age 16, and the goal of these are to help the students prepare for life after school. So what will they do following post-secondary education or following secondary education? Will it be independent living? Will they go into employment? Will they go into post-secondary education, etc.? And then these goals or services should be based on measurable post-secondary goals. So you want to make sure there's something that just like the IEP goals can be measured. Um, a couple more slides around measurement and progress towards annual goals. I'll let you kind of read through those. A couple special considerations related to the content of the IEP. So I'll let you read through those as well. And then placement decisions should be made by the IEP team, including the parents, and they should be determined after the IEP is developed. And again, should be decided after the least restrictive environment is determined. So placement can be tricky, but it involves critical conversations between the parents, the special educators, and the general educators, and really anyone else involved on the team. Um, and I'd say that placement is probably one of the biggest, not challenges, but most frequently cited areas of tense IEP meetings, if you will, because parents, like I said, often want their kiddos in a particular setting, and the team doesn't necessarily always agree with that, and it becomes, um, a bit of a tough conversation to have. But placement decisions are critical, and you want to make sure that they are assigned with the best intentions for the student. So